Good afternoon, A-Push. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about what you missed in class, or possibly have this video serve as a review. So we're picking back up with the question, how did the exchanges within the Atlantic world impact the development of colonial societies? Particular emphasis today is going to be on the movement of goods and develop a better understanding of Britain's theory of empire, which was mercantilism. So, you might remember that in that Atlantic world, the Atlantic serves as a, quote, saltwater highway. The movement across the Atlantic was fierce and intense. As these lines show, there are many ships moving goods across the Atlantic throughout the 1700s. Part of what we're going to be thinking about is what caused this to happen. What caused this to increase in such a surge by the early to late 1700s? And then also, what was the effect on the colonies themselves? How did this increased movement of goods begin to impact what was happening in the colonies before 1754? So to start, let's make sure we have a clear understanding of the word mercantilism. Keep in mind that this is an economic theory, and this economic theory and the economists that prescribed to this economic theory believed that the world's wealth was finite. As a result, the goal of the mother country, in this case Great Britain, was to enrich the mother country. So to achieve that goal, empires like Great Britain would conquer land to acquire new markets. So the colonies are going to be used, the 13 American colonies, along with Britain's other colonies around the world, will be used to produce raw materials to continue to help enrich the mother country. Now, part of mercantilism requires that there is some kind of control of trade. So England is going to create a set of laws better known as the Navigation Acts, and they're going to enforce those Navigation Acts with military power. The Navigation Acts are going to vary, but the one thing that we might begin to notice in the middle column of the purpose for each of these acts is that the words like goods, or textiles, hats, molasses, iron products, which are all forms of goods, is what England is trying to control. So the Navigation Acts sought to control the trade across that Atlantic Ocean. These rules are going to be put in place, and rules are going to be enforced with the British Navy. However, many of these rules, as you see in the third column, are going to be mostly ignored by the colonists or partially obeyed. In part, this reason is that the British Empire rules with a very kind of relaxed rule over its colonies. We call this salutary neglect. The reason why England is going to have a very lax policy in the late 16 and early 1700s is because it has colonies in other places. And for the most part, the colonies in America were obeying the rules, providing the mother country with raw materials that England would then produce into manufactured goods and send back to the colonies. The other reason why the colonies are going to begin to disobey more and more of these laws is because an economic theory develops on this side of the Atlantic. We call that capitalism. The economists who prescribe to capitalism believe that there is no limit to the world's to the world's wealth. Rather, there should be a focus on opening up trade. And so the colonists are going to begin to seek trade with other countries. Now, what would the colonies get out of complying to these laws? Well, they would get England's protection. And at this time in colonial history, the protection of the English Empire against the French, against the Dutch, and against the Spanish is one that the colonists are willing to take on. That will soon change, but not quite yet. So, mercantilism is the guiding way, the guiding economic theory of the British Empire. The goal was to become as self-sufficient as possible so that wealth would flow into the borders of England, not so easily out of. When we take a look at how this actually begins to look on a map, it is better known as the triangular trade. Of course, this wasn't a perfect trade. I mean, a perfect triangle. You might see that there is some kind of imbalance. So when I'm looking at this map, a couple of things immediately pop to mind. The first are the colors on the map. I'm noticing that the red represents British-controlled trade. I also notice the blue controlled by the Americans. As I look at those, I begin to see that some of the arrows, for instance, the blue arrow that flows out of Boston and the other colonies to Great Britain, the tobacco, indigo, flour, and lumber at the top of the map, it's a one-way arrow. Similarly, the manufactured goods coming back into the colonies is a one-way arrow. Look at the arrow off to the left, the one that is going from the colonies into the West Indies. That one is a two-way arrow, which implies that there's a little bit more of a colonial control of that trade. The colonies themselves are seeking to trade with the West Indies. Consider the products that the colonies might in fact trade with the West Indies. The colonies able to produce goods like lumber, which could be used to build shelter, flour, and grains, which could be used to produce food, might be goods that the West Indies needs. In fact, in the West Indies are sugar plantations. And on those sugar plantations, slaves are working, and so it is a pretty good opportunity for the colonists to trade things like grain and lumber and fish with the West Indies, and in return get sugar. Sugar that then could be used in the production of things like rum. Now, on this particular map, I might also notice that the arrows are, some are really small and narrow, and others are really fat and wide. This tells me that there is some kind of exchange that's happening, and the size begins to tell me that the amount of trade might be larger between two areas. So I notice again that there's quite a bit of trade between the colonies and the West Indies. Notice the number of slaves, for instance, that Britain controls into the West Indies, but the number of slaves that are coming into the colonies are not nearly as much. Okay? All of this is beginning to show me that there is going to be a way in which the colonies are going to seek some kind of other way to acquire products. If England is going to control their trade through the Navigation Acts, the colonies are certainly going to look for ways to circumnavigate those acts. When they do this, of course, that is going to enrich the traders, those that are involved in the trade, not so much the landowners. Landowners like the tobacco plantation owners of Virginia are already getting quite rich by trading with Great Britain. Now, in looking at this map, I might want to begin to think about the causes. Why did this triangular trade even develop in the first place? Well, as your book mentions, certainly the triangular trade will develop in response to the British mercantile policies. So not necessarily the laws themselves, but this theory, the idea that Britain's going to control the trade, will give rise to the arrows going in different directions. Another thing to consider is that there had to be some kind of need for resources. Europe sought resources. In order to produce manufactured goods, they need to acquire more resources. So the colonization of new lands, which really started with Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, is going to precipitate, is going to begin this back and forth movement of goods across the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, we could focus on some of those raw materials found in the colonies. The tobacco in Virginia, the lumber in New England, or even the sugar in the West Indies is going to increase the trade among the different Atlantic powers that are sitting here, like Europe, Africa, and the colonies of North, Central, South America. So what are the effects of all of this? Well, we can certainly think about the fact that on this map, I begin to see port cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Charleston in the colonies. These cities are going to begin to grow, and port cities become very significant centers of trade and culture for all of British America. Within these cities, you're going to see the growth of what we would call a meddling or a middle class. These middle class people are not the wealthy landowners. They are not the colonial elite. But they're also not at the other end of the spectrum, indentured servants that won their freedom, or workers that work with their hands. In fact, this middle class group of merchants is going to become quite wealthy as a result of the ways in which they dabble in the triangular trade. Another effect of this, of course, if we think back to our earlier studies, would be the growth of a slave society in the South. Virginia, along with other Southern colonies, will become dependent on slave labor as those products like tobacco, rice, sugar become a little bit more widely planted and grown within the colonies themselves. We might want to think about also that circumventing the Navigation Acts becomes a major enterprise. This too is an effect that the colonies are going to become very adept at doing. Circumnavigating the Navigation Acts is going to become a major enterprise and a source of wealth throughout the colonies. Certainly, as the end of chapter 4 shows us, war will come. War between England and France will begin to become much more prevalent, as we see with the French and Indian War. One of the reasons being, of course, is that there is a search for these empires like France and England to control the trade, to control the goods of that trade, and obviously they want to expand their empire to have more land to procure more raw materials. So, in review, you want to be thinking about this question that we started with. How did the exchange of goods within the Atlantic world impact the development of the colonial societies? We returned back to, and we started with the definition of mercantilism. We then moved to the Navigation Acts, which are the ways in which England is going to ensure that the system is put into place by law. And then looking toward how that triangular trade begins to emerge and the effects of that triangular trade. Definitely see me for the paper copy that you missed in class. Hope you all have a great evening. Thanks so much for listening. See you tomorrow.